I unfortunately get asked way too often, like, why do you hate the Republicans so freaking much? And it's like, if you want, it's frustrating because it's like I find myself wondering, like, why more people don't have strong feelings about against these guys, and it's like, it's the experience of just watching them in power over the past couple of years, where like they hold it hostage over and over and over again, you know, in order to try to extract cuts to programs that are pretty popular with the American people who don't want to see, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security actually cut at all. They're not good. They're not interested in that, sort of thing, and watching that happen. And those systems have helped a lot of people over the years. And we don't take as much of a clean, perspective that the government doesn't is never there to help. I mean, we take a very like the government is sometimes there to help, but sometimes it's in the way. It's not that simple. I mean, Reagan's perspective about the government was an oversimplification, running simple slogans that just didn't accurately describe reality. Some obviously nobody likes it when the police are kicking in their door to enforce some law that they feel that you've broken. But when the government, when you're down there at the Social Security office or the health department getting food stamps and everything else, people have a very different view of the government in that set of circumstances, and that's also part of the government. And while people might not enjoy the line, it is kind of nice to be in a building where people actually give a shit about you, like. But yeah, they have this mentality, like Reaganism had this point of view where it was basically like the government is always the enemy, and it was like that's just not that has not been my lived experience. The government maybe at times is in the way, but it's not always the case, and I'm not really actually a big subscriber to the idea and economic thought of crowding out, because it's like most of us don't have the skills to take advantage of those opportunities even if the government is doing those jobs that the private sector could fill in the role of doing. Most of us don't really have the ability to actually take advantage of those opportunities if they were to actually open up when the government moved out of the way. And it's like it's a very pretentious economic concept that it's just it's not something that I really believe in much at all, but I am familiar with it. And but the truth of the matter is just that I don't see things the way that they do. I mean, I don't see the government as always part and parcel of the problem. And I don't have that outlook and perspective that takes a very black and white view of things, and has no moral nuance to anything at all. And I look at them, and it's like their perspective is just so knee jerk. Like, I don't want any new taxes ever, and it just doesn't. It's just it's not practical, because of it. Like, we can't. That just see the problem with it with taxation is that tax. There's a saying, that there was that death and taxes will always be with us, and you know the truth of the matter is just that there are certain things that we need a government to actually be doing. We need a government to be trying to, you know, push America's youth through the public education system. We need it to do certain things to provide for the people, and it needs money to do these things. It can't do it completely, free of any cost to them at all. And this idea that you can have no taxes at all, and you know it just doesn't work in reality. And I mean, I hate it because it's like, yeah, I mean, nobody likes paying that stuff, admittedly. I mean, I sympathize. And but the problem with the American public is just that so many of them want all these services from the government, but they don't want to actually have to contribute anything to the process at all. Like, I've voted, for property tax raises, like, very incremental myself, that would end up impacting us, just because of the fact that there were services in the state that I wanted, that I believed in enough to actually, contribute, towards paying, like the library levy. that passed here in Oregon a while back. But we're talking about like why I dislike the Republicans so strongly, and really it has to do with well, it was the experience of watching, them try to pit furloughed workers against and meal on people on Meals on Wheels against people on Social Security and the shutdown dynamics and who it ended up impacting, and the fact that they did this and tried to use leverage in these negotiations to force very unpopular and draconian policies down the throat of the Democratic coalition, which really just had no interest in taking that shit. And even if it meant that the government effectively stayed shut down for like the whole damn thing, and they keep doing it. It's like one cycle of this bullshit after another, after another, after another, and I find it rather insufferable to that nothing really ever seems to be shaken up and changed. And another like I'm struggling to really find my words here in all this with it when it comes to the rationale, but that's pretty big on the list of why I don't like them much at all. I don't like the way that they want to force women. They want to end abortion rights, and they want to force women to give birth even if they don't want to. They don't care how she feels about it, and they'll raise heaven and earth to basically force a woman to give birth to an unwanted child, and then you know and then that's it. Fuck them, they're on their own basically. And that mentality with them, I mean. And then it's the fact that there are so many of these Christian nationalists that align themselves with them, where it's like they want to force their religion down people's throats when people don't want that. People don't want to have these systems compulsorily thrown down their throats, or thrown down their throats, or live in a theocracy. And like, I'm sure there are many people that are Christian that would realize just how dystopian of a hellscape America would be under a Christian theocracy. It's not even going to be good for the majority of Christians, to say the least. I mean, if you think that this country turning into a theocratic Christian nation would be good for you just because you happen to be a Christian, you've got another thing coming. These people that want to turn it into this should fucking move to Saudi Arabia if they want to see what the reality of a theocracy is really like, or Iran, and one of those other nations in the Middle East. It's just it's not a good it's not going to be a good experience for us here in America to go under that kind of system. Even if you happen to be a Christian, it will be bad for you too. I'm not excluding Christians in my perspective on this. I really think that some of you need to rethink it. There needs to be like a secular movement within Christendom to realize that like the outcome of a theocratic American nation would be bad for the majority of you. It just would not be a pleasant experience. And it's like we've got this confinement of like these Christian nationalists who want to turn this country in from what it is into which is a secular state, into a completely Christian country, where like the law is basically dictated on the basis of what the Bible says in matters. And this is what the Republicans are like. And it's like it's anxiety when I'm seeing the religious right happen to cozy up and have such a stranglehold on the Republican Party, that what's coming ultimately are all kinds of religious hogwash in terms of laws. They frighten me on that front of things. And it's this concern. And it's like when you see these Christian nationalists basically forming a unity on one side of the aisle, you kind of just by default end up going to the other side of the aisle, whether you love them or not, because at least with them in office, enacting that kind and imposing those kind of moral systems down our throats becomes incredibly difficult for them to actually do. Like, I would also preface this by saying that I'm not hugely fond of the Democrats, to say the least, because as much as I despise the Republicans, I find that they look at the Republicans and they see the games and the antics that they play and their refusal to compromise, and they'll castigate them as being, basically intransigent and, not actually ever compromising. And it's like, now I'm not saying compromise is bad, but in politics and in the context of politics, things are a little bit, a little bit more complicated than just saying it's always a good thing, and that that there are, and flexibility is not necessarily the way to go or necessarily the best thing, because it can lead you to sell out some really sacred, or what you would consider to be that way, subjectively speaking, your most treasured core values, the things that you really strongly believe in, are things that you might say, well, there's a time to torture people, when you're under this set of circumstances. And, I just think that we're better than that. And we're better than that, even if, we've been hit and victimized by that part of the world. The United States doesn't need to torture people. It can do better, and it needs to return to that. Like, there is never a time. We need to return to this mentality that there's never a time that the United States ever engages in torture, and there's no context under which it's acceptable, for us to behave in that barbaric fashion as a country. It's repulsive that this is what's been endorsed by so many of them. And it's like the Democrats, they don't get it. They think that the lack of compromising is the problem with the Republicans, when in reality, for me, it's more what the party actually wants that I've got a problem with, than the fact that they behave in an incredibly obstructionist fashion. I think that maybe the Democrats should copy that strategy when Republicans are in power, filibuster everything. But it's the fact. And one other thing that I was thinking about just before I came to this video, it's the fact that their party, perpetually holds itself and its own interest over the national interest to such an extent, and then it has the nerve and the audacity to point the finger and say that people like us, happen to lack patriotism. Like, they held up an entire agenda during the entire Obama years that would have, the bills that the Democratic Party wanted to pass would have done good for the economy, and they filibustered all of it. And if you, I learned about the caucus room conspiracy, where they basically met in this restaurant down there in D.C., where they decided that they were going to be a very partisan institution that went out of its way to, derail the president by, trying to harness the fact that there would be a misperception of reality, that both sides were to blame because of the fact that they couldn't just put aside their differences and work together, by filibustering goddamn everything that they could, they and holding up any sort of agenda from actually managing to pass, that wasn't just the basics to keep the government up and doing, the bare minimum of anything. And it drove me just crazy. Like, there's this whole like there's this insanity with these guys, and like, they've got this idea that the Democrats lack patriotism. Well, how is it patriotic to do everything you can to hold up an agenda that would have benefited the U.S. national economy, in order that to leave it in such a shithole state and a destroyed state after the financial crisis for like 8 years of the Obama presidency, where you blocked every goddamn thing that you possibly could that would have been good for the economy as far as the Democratic policy proposals. And you got in the way of all of it as a party. They got in the way of every single fucking one of them, and the economy might not have been it's in such a shitter for as long as it was in the shitter during those years. And it just, these guys, they've got this idea, in their heads that they're the patriots, and that people like us, we don't love America. And it's like, how can you be said to love America if you won't do or allow any goddamn bill through that will benefit the economy, just because of the fact that that bill happens to be being proposed by a Democrat, in the whole thing. But these guys, like, the Democrats, look at this just complete refusal to compromise, and they're like, this is the fucking problem with these guys. And it's like, yeah, but why don't you ever take a page out of their book? So, I'm not uncritical of the Democratic Party. I think that they should take inspiration from the Republicans and copy some of the terrible antics that they've been up to, as far as that stuff is concerned. Obstruct, go right the fuck ahead. I mean, in fact, I don't want the Republican agenda, so obstruct it for fuck's sake. I mean, why am I voting for you at this point, given the unlikelihood that you'll ever actually be able to get an agenda through? If I'm not, I have to find some other reason to rationalize it to myself, and the only thing that's left is that gridlock is superior to the Republican agenda. That's really all I'm ultimately left with Team Blue. So I'm not saying that Team Blue is fucking perfect, because Team Blue, prides itself on not being as partisan as the other side of the aisle. That's what it thinks is so great about it. Because partisanship is clearly the problem, right? That's the conclusion that it's come to, and it's like, I'm not buying that one. It's basically what the Republicans want, and the fact that they obstruct everything that the Democrats want, but it's not that they're partisan or even that they obstruct. It's that they want, it's the fact that what they obstruct has hurt the economy as much as it has, basically. You know, the economy might have recovered a lot quicker if a lot of those Democratic bills during the Obama years had been allowed to pass and been gotten through the Senate and their incredibly large and willful protests to do it. And if you look at statistics, you'll see that the filibuster and walkouts in the state legislators used to be rare, but over time they've become more and more common. And that's not like that. The idea that that is supported by the fact that the Democrats have moved so far to the left ultimately falls apart, because although there are some radical elements within the Democratic Party that are elected officials now, like AOC and others in this whole thing, it's increasingly like the people at the center of the party that actually are holding the vast majority of the influence in the whole thing. So moderate Democrats, like, still for the most part, despite the AOC have the party a stranglehold over what the party how the party actually governs, regardless of what it looks like on television, and it's the performance that's put on during the primaries, basically. And so what I'm really driving home at is that the Democrats go out of their way. They pride themselves on not being, as partisan as the other side of the aisle, and as the and they're constantly lecturing about how certain things should or should not be partisan. And it's like, it's not. I don't necessarily disagree that they shouldn't be partisan, but this is a party that doesn't really want to be partisan at all, ever, itself. And so there's this idea, that both sides are like this, or like that, both sides have this sort of equivalence on this. And it turns out to be like kind of bullshit. Like, the Democrats are not anywhere near as partisan, and despite the existence of people like me who are kind of very partisan Democrats, they're and AOC and everything, it's still the moderates that have basically a stranglehold over the Democratic agenda. And so it's just, things being what they are about all of that. Like, I don't think the Democrats are perfect. I just really despise the Republicans, you know and so it's not as if I'm singing the praises of the Democrats, and I don't think that they're being too soft and weak, and that they won't propose big, bold, progressive legislation and bills, and try to campaign on those issues. But I'm basically in the boat of, right now, I just feel like blocking the Republican agenda is the primary thing that I want the Democrats to do. And see, that's just it. The Democrats aren't, doing that. And there's this idea, I guess, in how people perceive it, and this idea that the Democrats went off the deep end. But if you look closer in reality, you'll see that despite the fact that there are these party members that are grabbing headlines for being so radical, the moderates are still calling pretty much all of the shots. Why they agitate from the sidelines, the way that they do in the party. And so you can say it's just not functionally, basically, like, equivalent to this idea, like, that there's this, you'd have to be pretty foolish to buy into it, which is just this idea that the Democrats went off the deep end. So of course, the number of filibusters skyrocketed and the number of walkouts in the state legislature skyrocketed. But it's not like that, because in order for it to truly be like that, you wouldn't have to have a party. You wouldn't have to have a party that's constantly lecturing about how certain things should not be partisan issues and distancing themselves from partisanship as much as they can and everything else. And so it's like the Democratic Party policy proposals have not gotten more extreme. What has become more extreme is the sheer number of filibusters. Like, they have obstructed now, like, like never before. That huge run up in a number of filibusters is not motivated by a Democratic Party that's gone too far to the left. It's not motivated, and the walkouts in the state chambers are not motivated by that sort of thing either. It's the petty grievances of certain elected officials, that are power hungry and are, trying to cling to power by any means necessary, that drives a lot of it. And so there's this rather, completely insane, perspective about all of it. And it's just like, they changed. Okay, the Democrats didn't really change to anywhere near the same extent. So it's, I find myself in this state. And for them to play the patriotism card, it's like, do you think that do you really truly think that it was patriotic to obstruct the entire Obama economic agenda and let the nation burn and suffer under an economy that took way longer to recover than it needed to as a consequence of that sort of behavior? Like, they will preach about patriotism an awful lot, and the Democrats not walking the walk, but then fail to actually do a goddamn thing that would prove their own goddamn patriotism. And in either event, how can Republicans be said to love America if America is both the country that elected Obama and elected Trump? They hate at least one side of this country entirely, but that side of this country is part of this country. It's legitimately part of it. Like, Biden's America is not a phony America. It's not a fake one, and Obama's America wasn't either. And so, they've got this, you know, silly asinine notion in their heads that somehow, I mean, that they love this country, but when they're faced with the reality of it, they find themselves cringing. I mean, if they really loved America, why would they be trying so goddamn hard to raise barriers against entry when it came to actually casting a ballot in our elections via, you know, not only via the process of enacting voter ID laws when voter fraud was never proven to be all that widespread, and that while it did exist, it wasn't terribly common, and that you were more likely to get struck by lightning than to actually commit an act of voter fraud. And then, of course, there are people that will slide into the comments and basically say, just ask anybody in business. But if people, how common fraud is, and it's like, no one's saying fraud isn't common in business, but they're saying that there is something fundamentally different at the core about the political process that makes the American people much more likely to engage in business fraud than they ever will be the actual political thing. And that's what needs to be said to those people. It's like, I'm sorry, but there is not an equivalent. It's not analogous. Basically, there is something that is literally fundamentally different about elections than there is business, which means that the American people, are far less likely to attempt to engage in fraud than they ever will be business fraud, you know? And so we actually are more likely to get struck by lightning than to engage in voter fraud in this whole thing, which makes voter ID laws are justified on a claim of widespread voter fraud that turns out to be bullshit and a hoax that never fucking was an issue. Like,
There is no evidence for widespread voter fraud that from credible sources. None. So voter ID laws are basically at their core a solution in in search of a problem that has not been proven and that there has been insufficient evidence to prove is actually an issue in the first place. And it's not just that, it's the fact that this party has worked overtime to to shut down polling locations all over the place so that voter lines were extremely long. Now, see, long lines in of themselves, they're great for old people, old folk who can afford to sit in the line for as long as they can, but there's a working class constituency that also votes that has to take time off work to wait in those lines. Many of them, when they're ridiculously long, will just simply give up in the middle of the damn thing and walk off and away from the polls, and that is a fucking tragedy. And it happens all the time now that there are fewer and fewer and fewer polling locations that the Republicans shut down because they were engaging in a deliberate effort to suppress the vote. And it's my contention that if you suppress the vote, you cheated, period, and there's nothing legitimate about your outcome. Like, I'm sorry, but if you won after you fucking did all this, you shut down polling location after polling location after polling location, and I mean, it's the same thing that you're basically accusing the Democrats of having won on the backs of a ton of voter fraud. Well, Republicans can't win without cheating by suppressing the vote.